detergents, but gets gleaming white with Tide with bleach. It'll knock your socks off and get them whiter. New Tide with bleach.
When legal disputes threaten, the People's Court peacekeeping mobile zooms into action.
You two seem to be at loggerheads.
He parked on my petunias.
Don't take the law in your own hands. Take a break and watch the People's Court.
Who was that man in the blue blazer?
The People's Court, weekdays at 3 on Channel 2.
Part 2 of the killing of JFK. Was it a conspiracy? On the next Geraldo.
The following is an NBC special presentation.
It was a fine autumn morning in the nation's capital. At the tomb of the unknown soldier, the sentry maintained a silent vigil over our honored dead. Before nightfall that November day in 1963, a new name would be added to the nation's roll of fallen heroes. A day earlier, President John F. Kennedy had left the White House for a political trip to Texas. He would not return to Washington alive. But that morning, few Americans would guess that calamity was about to strike the country. For most, it was a time of optimism. America seemed to be on the right track. The twist was still big. At the White House, Mrs. Kennedy had given the president private lessons. The Chicago Bears were leading the Western Conference of the National Football League. The civil rights movement was underway, but it had a long way to go. In Hollywood that day, plans were underway for the film production of the musical Camelot.
Don't let it be forgot that once there was a spot for one brief shining moment that was known as...
Kennedy's Camelot was brief indeed. The administration of John F. Kennedy lasted only 1,037 days. Now, 25 years later, we're still struggling to deal with the loss, the myths, and the memories of John Fitzgerald Kennedy and his time.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Many Americans can still recall vividly being moved by the words of John Kennedy. And news of his death moved them in other ways. It marked a turning point in their lives and in the direction of this country. Tonight, in this report, we'll recall 1963, JFK and that day in November.
NBC News presents JFK, that day in November.
This NBC News special, JFK, That Day in November, is sponsored in part by Kellogg's Corn Flakes. Simple, delicious, and surprising. Taste them again for the first time. And by Wang Laboratories. Wang makes it work.
You've got this all wrong. You want to make news of the cereal today, you need a gimmick. Putting a whole banana inside a little bran biscuit, stuff like that. These are just flakes. I don't think I've tasted anything like it. Simple, light, it's really very good. Well, how about that? A cereal that doesn't need a gimmick.
Kellogg's Corn Flakes.
Corn Flakes?
Taste them again for the first time.
I was hired midway into the revolution. The independent forces, PC users, had begun to form guerrilla work groups hooked together like tinker toys. Stubbornly independent, but cut off from the main source of power. No electronic mail from one outpost to the other. No shared resources. Chaos was the price they were paying for freedom. So we put up Wang's PC land. It networks the PCs, yes. But it also networks the networks.
Police call it the priest killings. 2 different murders committed in the same way. It could be the work of a serial killer.
Killing Catholic priests.
Catch a criminal on Unsolved Mysteries Wednesday.
A misty rain was falling in Fort Worth as President Kennedy emerged from his hotel that morning. Even his admirers were surprised by the size of the crowd. President Kennedy was in top form.
Mr. Kennedy is organizing yourself. Take longer. But of course, you look better than you do.
Immediately afterward, the president spoke at a fundraising breakfast. Accompanying him throughout his Texas visit were Vice President Lyndon Johnson and Texas Governor John Connally. When Mrs. Kennedy entered the auditorium, the applause was spectacular. When John Kennedy left Washington for Texas, he was on a political mission. He wanted to heal the Texas Democratic Party, badly split between conservatives and liberals. Remember, on that day in November, the 1964 presidential election was less than a year away, and it was very much on Kennedy's mind. After all, John F. Kennedy was a consummate politician.
He was the greatest politician, and you know what? He saw politics as an art. He told me that he found politics more rewarding than any other profession.
Dave Powers, a loyal family friend and now curator of the Kennedy Library in Boston.
He smiled and said, of course, if you are going to be in politics, the place to be is the White House, where you can do the most good for the most people.
John Kennedy had been taught to think big at an early age. His father, a shrewd, aggressive investor, gave his children a life of privilege. But for all of their creature comforts, the Kennedy children were drilled in the importance of a life of competition and achievement. Money was not enough. They were expected to bring honor and respect to the Kennedy name. John Kennedy was the second of 9 children, a shy, bookish sort when he graduated from Harvard. He was only 23 when he wrote a bestseller about Britain's failure to prepare for World War II. For his own part, he plunged into the war, commanding a PT boat in the Pacific, winning a medal for valor. As a returning war hero, with his father's money to bankroll him and his Irish name and charm, Kennedy was a natural for Boston politics, winning 3 terms in the House from a working-class district. When John Kennedy challenged Henry Cabot Lodge for the Senate in 1952, it was a family triumph, the beginning of the Kennedy family political dynasty. When it came to politics, the Kennedys took no prisoners, and John Kennedy became a bright new star on the national scene.
From the first day I met him, John F. Kennedy was in love with the English language. He admired great speeches.
Theodore Sorensen joined then Senator John F. Kennedy's staff in 1953 and stayed with him to the end. He was Kennedy's alter ego. When you would work together on something, the inaugural address, the speech in Berlin, how much of it was Sorensen and how much of it was Kennedy? You've always been very modest about this.
Well, I don't think I'll change a 30-year pattern of being unable to distinguish between what was his work or his words and what were mine. They were all his speeches. He was the one who had to take responsibility for them, whether they were controversial, good or bad.
Not many people realize that John Kennedy lived most of his life in pain from chronic back ailments. In 1954, he nearly died after surgery to alleviate the back problem. During his convalescence, he wrote another book, Profiles in Courage. That won the Pulitzer Prize.
Ladies and gentlemen of this convention.
Kennedy was determined to move up, running for the Democratic vice presidential nomination in 1956, when he was only 39 and Jackie was just 27. When he lost that, Kennedy immediately began campaigning for the top job in 1960. Again, it was a family crusade led by brother Bobby. John Kennedy was dismissed by many in the party establishment as a privileged playboy senator. But to the Democratic delegates, he was a dashing new hope for the future. And Kennedy won the nomination on the first ballot.
He and I had a standard joke that came from our Irish mothers. They used to believe the first time you visit a church, you could make 3 wishes. And the first time I mentioned it to him, we were in the Holy Family Church in Anchorage, Alaska. I knew he had never, ever been there before. It's the start of the campaign. And I said, Jack, don't forget the 3 wishes. And as he genuflected and looked toward the altar, he whispered, New York, Pennsylvania, and Texas. And you know, He carried all three.
The Vice President, Mr. Kennedy, would you mind?
The fall campaign was a classic. Kennedy against Nixon. The new generation of American politics in a new era. Television.
I think Mr. Nixon is an effective leader of his party. I hope he would grant me the same. The question before us is, which point of view and which party do we want to lead the United States?
Kennedy won the debates, a turning point in his campaign, and on election night he did prevail, but just barely. It was one of the closest races in history.
You, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
Kennedy didn't have much of a political mandate, but he did have a bold new approach to the presidency.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
The new frontier was underway, and John Kennedy embodied the spirit and the energy of this new era in American life. McGeorge Bundy was director of Kennedy's National Security Council.
Professor Bundy, why do you think, as a historian, that John F. Kennedy looms so large in the consciousness of America 25 years after his death?
Mostly what my generation remembers and what others seem also to feel is the extraordinary human quality of the man. One of the most attractive human beings that happened in our generation.
However people felt about Kennedy's politics, they recognized that in the popular culture, he was more than president. He was a star. One of America's leading radio personalities of the time, Cousin Brucey.
I liked his eyes. I liked the way he looked at me. He looked at me when he was on television all the time. I became feeling that he was one of my cousins. I knew the man. I had great respect for him.
Jack Parr, in those days, America's leading television host.
Been running in 7 primaries since January. But Jack was a different person than you saw on camera. He was very controlled, very sophisticated, very much in charge, very smiling, But Jack was really basically an Irish politician. And he was a bawdy guy who said funny things.
We're gonna twist it, till we tear the house down.
Chubby Checker, the entertainer.
When he spoke, I believed him. I believed when John F. Kennedy said that this country belonged to everybody. I believed him, and I liked him. I liked the way he looked.
Johnny Unitas of the Baltimore Colts, pro football's best-known quarterback.
The president was an outstanding football fan. I found Jack to be very easygoing, very easy to talk with, just on just about any type of subject. And he was a fun-loving guy. And I think that you could see his personality and where everyone loved the guy.
In Dallas, the clock above the Mercantile Bank ticked away the moments to the president's arrival. In the Texas School Book Depository, along the president's intended route, a man named Lee Harvey Oswald had been working for the past 5 weeks. Oswald fancied himself a champion of left-wing causes, including Castro's Cuba. He'd learned marksmanship in the Marines. Then he emigrated briefly to the Soviet Union and married a Russian woman. After his return to America, he used an assumed name to purchase a military rifle from a mail-order house. But Dallas was not paying much attention to losers like Lee Harvey Oswald. This was a boom town, noted for oil money, conservative politics, and blue-nose attitudes. But that didn't stop the natives from flocking to the film version of Tom Jones, one of the more uninhibited films of 1963. Times were changing faster than we realized. But most Americans still seem comfortable with the past and confident about the future. Most school days began with the Pledge of Allegiance. It was not yet a political issue. Neither was service to the country. The draft was a fixture. Every young man registered and, if needed, served 2 years in the armed forces. Most served with pride. Personal computers, of course, hadn't been invented yet. Existing computers were big enough to fill a large room. American industry still led the world, We were the largest producer of steel.
The cars that keep Chevrolet going great in '63 at your Chevrolet dealers.
95% of the cars sold in this country were made here. Now, only 60%. Back then, America was still the world's leading producer of television sets, radios, and kitchen appliances. Few people worried about American competitiveness or productivity.
I think the strength of the economy in those years was of high importance.
Historian Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., who was a member of Kennedy's White House staff.
And I think obviously this made it possible to sustain both a strong defense program and also strong social programs. Those were still within our economic competence.
John Kennedy saw space as an important part of the new frontier. We were behind the Russians, but he had an audacious dream for that time.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
Most Americans were getting their news from television, and the top-rated news program was the Huntley-Brinkley Report.
Mr. Kennedy pointed out to Limas there are more people of Irish descent in the United States than there are in Ireland. Good night, Chet.
Good night, David, and good night for NBC News.
The hottest television news story, civil rights. As founder of the Congress of Racial Equality, James Farmer was on the cutting edge of the civil rights movement.
Kennedy offered a new America. He said, we want to stride into the new horizon. Blacks said, yes, yes. In the spring of 1963, there were the great demonstrations in Birmingham demanding total desegregation of the whole city, led by Martin Luther King. He succeeded in letting the American people, the citizens of this whole nation, know the horror of bigotry.
Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them.
Here's a man from an enormously privileged background. How much did he truly understand about what was going on in ghettos, on the factory floor?
I would say that in the White House, he understood not as much about that life as he should have, but far more than he previously had. As president, he took an increasing interest in the struggle for civil rights, and he met with black leaders. His emotions on that subject were still developing at the time of his death.
It was an evolution in his own thinking and in his own feeling, but it was a climax of a process. And for that, we are undyingly grateful.
A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all.
August 1963, a march on Washington for civil rights, a massive call to conscience. John Kennedy took notice and began to offer a more active voice in the cause. Black Americans knew they had a friend in the White House. Georgia Congressman John Lewis was then head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
And you go into almost any black home, a black church in the heart of the South, and even in some of the urban centers across this country, you'll see a photograph of John F. Kennedy.
This is one country. It has become one country because all of us and all the people who came here had an equal chance to develop their talents. We cannot say to 10% of the population that you can't have that right, that your children can't have the chance to develop whatever talents they have. That the only way that they're going to get their rights is to go in the street and demonstrate. I think we owe them and we owe ourselves a better country than that.
A fender bender on the freeway.
You?
No, a guy, anyone. This is just to show her when.
The weather had cleared when the president's aircraft landed at Dallas. The enthusiastic crowd was a politician's dream. despite the city's reputation as a nest of right-wingers. All over Dallas, people were excited about seeing the presidential couple. Bobby Hargis was a young Dallas policeman assigned to the presidential escort.
When they stepped off the airplane, it was like meeting a Hollywood star or something like that.
School teacher Jean Hill went with a girlfriend.
We were going to get to see this great president of ours that we thought was such a Prince Charming and his Cinderella wife, and it was all the things that fairy tales are made of, and he was ours. He was America's.
Charles Brem took his son to the event.
I was truly excited. I was going to see the President of the United States.
At about the same hour, co-workers noticed that Lee Harvey Oswald was lurking on the 6th floor of the book depository. That morning, Oswald had smuggled his rifle into the building. At the airport, Jacqueline Kennedy was the American equivalent of visiting royalty. Her grace and beauty were undeniable, but there was something else. She was at once Mrs. John F. Kennedy, First Lady, and at the same time, she was Jackie, the brightest star in her own constellation. And think of this, Jackie Kennedy was only 34 years old on that day in November. The trip to Texas was one of her first official acts since the premature birth of a son the previous summer. The baby, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, died in less than 40 hours. He's buried here at Arlington National Cemetery beside his father. The political arena was not her natural habitat. Mrs. Kennedy was a star on that stage, but she was then, and remains today, a very private person. Privacy disappeared when wealthy young socialite Jacqueline Bouvier married millionaire Senator John F. Kennedy in 1953. Mrs. Kennedy found herself being interviewed on network television, even about their honeymoon.
My husband caught a 10-foot bearfish, which he has in his office.
A real prize catch. Did you help him haul it in?
Well, not really, but I was in the boat. All I did was pour water on him.
On your husband?
Because it was so hot in that boiling sun, and he had to fight the fish for about 3 hours. So I had to stay there pouring water on him.
When her husband was elected president, she became the most stylish First Lady of the century. Letitia Baldridge was her social secretary.
Now somebody young had come into the White House with a young, beautiful wife and 2 young children. And it just seemed to make a renaissance in this country. And Mrs. Kennedy turned the White House into a museum of great American furniture. And the furnishings suddenly became beautiful, and the house became beautiful.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Kennedy would like to say a word to you.
And her husband often used her language skills to advantage.
Me siento orgullosa que mi hijo haya conocido a sus oficiales.
Jacqueline Kennedy's elegant presence at state occasions often attracted more attention than the president.
I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris, and I've enjoyed it.
Her own trips abroad received massive coverage. Women everywhere tried to imitate the Jackie look.
The way she put her hair curlers in her hair, what kind of food she fed her babies, whatever it was, they just wanted to imitate her all the way.
Mrs. Kennedy brought a new sense of glamour to the White House and to the image of the American presidency. But this was no frail porcelain princess. Jackie Kennedy was tough in her own way. And for all of her privilege, she could come off as the perfect wife and mother.
I think it doesn't matter what else you do if you don't do that part well, if you fail your husband and your children. That really is the role which means the most to me, though obviously I have a deep sense of obligation for the others, but that's the one that comes first.
From the beginning, Jacqueline Kennedy tried to raise their children out of the glare of publicity. Caroline was 3 years old when her father became president. Today, she is Mrs. Caroline Kennedy Schlossberg, a lawyer and a mother. John F. Kennedy Jr. was born 2 weeks after Kennedy's election. Today, he's almost 28. He's a law student in New York. Like their mother, they avoid publicity. But 25 years ago, they were America's darlings, the most famous children in the world. When Carolyn and John arrived on Pennsylvania Avenue with their pets, toys, and playmates, they were the youngest residents of the White House in years.
The White House was not staid and formal and official in those days. It was always warm and welcoming and filled with the sounds of children.
John F. Kennedy was President of the United States and a proud father.
He had John swimming when he was 1.5 years old, and he was so proud of him. And Caroline would be in the water with a life preserver. They'd go out in the honey fifths, and they'd all go into the water. He was so proud of them, you know, and especially that last summer that John now is approaching 3. And he'd say, look at the build on John. And then, you know, he'd say, isn't Caroline pretty? And, you know, that he was so happy with them.
These children were also a tremendous political asset. Former columnist Charles Bartlett was a close friend of President Kennedy.
I used to be amused because he was always stretching to use the children to get a little favorable publicity. He said, John, this is going to be your week. He said, we're bringing macaroni in from the country, and you're going to be photographed riding around.
John Kennedy had a finely tuned sense of how to get favorable publicity. Among the modern presidents, few have had a better relationship with the American press. David Halberstam, now an author, then a young newspaperman, thought many reporters treated John F. Kennedy too kindly.
There was a sort of sense of he was Superman. I mean, whatever it was, he did it better. He read more books faster. He and Jackie had the perfect marriage, the perfect children. They had the perfect cabinet. I mean, whatever he did well. And there was a great deal of silliness.
But it was difficult for reporters not to be charmed by a president who treated many of them as personal friends, a man who held a press conference every 2 weeks. Those televised press conferences were equally valuable to the president. His skill and wit made him unnatural in front of the cameras.
Ladies and gentlemen. Mr. President, it's been a long time since we've had a definitive report on your health from the best possible source. How is your aching back?
Well, it depends on the weather, political and otherwise.
At a press conference, he'd get a very nasty question. And he would point at the reporter and he'd say, George, I can't believe you asked me that, and then point a finger at the next journalist, and everybody would be breaking up laughing. The question never got answered.
Yes, Mr. President.
Mr. President, the Democratic platform in which you ran for election promises to work for equal rights for women, including equal pay. What have you done for the women according to the promises of the platform?
Well, I'm sure we haven't done enough, and I must say I am a strong believer in equal pay for equal work, and I think that we ought to do better than we're doing, and I'm glad that you reminded me of it, Mr. President.
One of the things we remember best about President Kennedy was his appreciation of humor, even at his own expense.
I want you to get this. It's much thinner than you gentlemen have been.
Vaughn Meader became an overnight star making fun of the Kennedy style and accent.
He's doing my gestures, and he's using my lines. Do not ask what this country can do for you. That's one of my original lines.
Actually, I listened to Mr. Meader's record, but I thought it sounded more like Teddy than it did me, but...
His wit, his charm, his intelligence, his storybook marriage, all of it was reported thoroughly. But what about President Kennedy's private life? What about those relationships with other women that we learned about later? Helen Thomas, now Dean of the White House Press Corps, was there during the Kennedy administration.
Although we heard rumors from time to time, nobody really followed it up, and I suppose if it had become more blatant, if he had gone into the tidal basin or followed a fan dancer, it would have been hard, or if he had wound up on in a police blotter. But otherwise, I think it was not pursued.
I think there was always sort of a back-channel word that John Kennedy had a vigorous personal life that existed in addition to his marital life.
Arthur Schlesinger, Jr. Would he be startled by the amount of reporting on personal lives that have done by the press these days and the lives of politicians?
I think he would be. In those days, the unspoken code of the press was that the private behavior of politicians was their own business so long as it did not affect their public behavior. That still seems to be a good rule.
The rules were different in those days. On TV, husbands always kissed their wives goodbye. Married couples slept in twin beds. A woman's place was in the home.
Well, at least that's settled. Now all you have to do is concentrate on being a wife.
Wives, no matter how old, were often called girls.
Can you tell if a girl's married just by looking at her?
Sure. Her hands give her away. After a lot of housework, her hands don't look so feminine, especially around the knuckles.
Publicly, at least, marriage was sacred. Affairs were scandalous. And there weren't nearly as many divorces. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton shocked the nation when their on-screen romance in the movie Cleopatra became an off-screen, torrid affair that broke up her marriage to Eddie Fisher. And New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller lost his bid for the Republican presidential nomination in part because he divorced his first wife, then remarried.
There was definitely more innocence. There was much more morality. And there was also a greater feeling of romance. People danced cheek to cheek in dark corners in nightclubs, moving to romantic music.
Teenagers in those days were much more worried about acne and prom dates than about AIDS or drugs.
Two future presidents meet in Houston. I'm Jan Carson. Also tonight on Nightcast, a laboratory here is taking youngsters from high chairs to high tech. Will it make them better adults? Chris Kelly has a special report. And President Kennedy is remembered tonight in Dallas.
Walgreens has been helping bring holiday magic to American families for over 4 generations. Isn't it nice having an easy-to-shop Walgreens drugstore nearby?
A Houston man opens a time capsule that he buried 25 years ago. We'll have that and much more tonight at 10.
What dry was. What dry is.
150 or 60 million is the responsibility of the President of the United States, and I propose to fulfill it.
Two scoops. You know what I wish, Stella? I wish Keller...
The motorcade through downtown Dallas didn't get underway until 11:55 in the morning. Policeman Bobby Hargis remembers the scene.
Well, the crowds were so big that they would fill the street up, and they would have to park. The crowd would have to park to let the motorcade and us through.
On the 6th floor of the book depository, Lee Oswald had shifted boxes to create a sniper's nest. Despite these friendly crowds, some in the presidential party were apprehensive about the Dallas trip. Just a few weeks earlier, United Nations Ambassador Adlai Stevenson had been struck with a sign and spit on by a crowd of Dallas conservatives. Recently, a pamphlet accusing JFK of treason had been distributed in Dallas. The day the president arrived, a full-page newspaper ad appeared, attacking his foreign policy as left-wing. Today, the idea that John F. Kennedy's foreign policy was somehow left-wing is laughable. Like Presidents Truman and Eisenhower, he was convinced the spread of communist influence was a direct threat to the United States, and John Kennedy was determined to stop it. However, he got off to a rocky beginning when a plan to overthrow Fidel Castro with an invasion by Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs failed miserably. The plan was inherited from the Eisenhower administration. The CIA and the Joint Chiefs of Staff recommended it.
Of course, the Bay of Pigs hurt him, angered him, because he realized that he had relied on experts, and as he said to me, I didn't get here relying on experts. I haven't done that before. I was stupid to do that. And that was the lowest moment of all.
That summer, his meeting with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev ended in disagreement. In August 1961, the Soviets built the Berlin Wall. There was tension, but no war. JFK sensed that the real challenge was elsewhere.
The great battleground for the defense and expansion of freedom today is the whole southern half of the globe, Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East.
For Kennedy, South Vietnam had become a major problem. To defeat the communist insurgency there, he sent American helicopters and thousands of additional military advisors. The Pentagon continued to tell the president that our side was winning. American journalists on the scene were reporting just the opposite. One of them was the New York Times man in Saigon, David Halberstam.
Well, JFK got mad at David Halberstam and made the mistake of trying to influence this publisher, and that just made the Times more stubborn, so that was a mistake.
I think he was heading to a first-class foreign policy failure, and I think he began to sense it. And in a situation like that, since everything else was going well for him in 1963, and everybody else was, so to speak, on the team, this one group that wasn't was this small group in Vietnam, and there was a quite systematic attempt, we didn't have great reputations then, to undermine our credibility, and it was very systematic, and it was not very pleasant.
25 years later, there still is disagreement over what the course of events in Vietnam might have been if Kennedy had lived.
Some of his admirers, as you know, say, well, he would have gotten out of it.
Sure, and it's very easy to project one's conclusions onto a dead man. I think that's a mistake. I myself believe that he hadn't decided.
But when Soviet missiles were discovered in Cuba, Kennedy was able to make a quick decision.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Kennedy confronted the Soviets with a dramatic display of toughness mixed with patience. The Soviet missiles were removed from Cuba. The young president's reputation as a world statesman soared. Berlin, June 1963.
All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
He was already admired in most of Latin America for his effort to create an alliance for progress to solve the massive social problems of that hemisphere.
This journey to Costa Rica has illuminated the minds of 180 million people of what a great opportunity and privilege we have to be associated together in our common cause.
And Kennedy had tapped into the mainstream of idealism in young America by deploying the Peace Corps into third world countries. Those were all works in progress. His most significant achievement was a treaty with the Soviet Union, which banned atmosphere testing of nuclear weapons.
Let us, if we can, step back from the shadows of war and seek out the way of peace. And if that journey is 1,000 miles or even more, let history record that we, in this land, at this time, took the first step.
Shortly before 12:30 p.m., the presidential motorcade reached Dealey Plaza, within view of the school book depository. The crowds were thinner here.
I jumped out into the street and I yelled, "Hey, Mr. President, look this way. We want to take your picture."
It sounded like a firecracker to me, and I thought, oh, Lord, you let it be a firecracker. And it looked like the president was bending over forward. And then when he raised back up is when that second shot hit him in the head.
I know I did a lot of praying between the bullet that wounded him and the one that killed him.
In a matter of seconds, the presidential limousine was racing toward Parkland Hospital.
When I lifted him out of the car with Clint Hill of the Secret Service and Roy Kellerman, his eyes were open, and I remember saying something like, "My God, Jack, what did they do?"
At the hospital, the president was wheeled into Trauma Room 1. An operating room was being prepared upstairs, but that massive bullet wound to the head had already made this a hopeless case. Outside, there was pandemonium, rumors of hope, then despair. Mac Kilduff, Assistant Presidential Press Secretary, assembled the press for the official announcement.
President John F. Kennedy died at approximately...
To have to say that he was dead was so final,
terribly final.
The handsome, dashing Ford Aerostar for 19...
House Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff has just announced that President Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time, which is about 35 minutes ago.
As the news of the president's death spread across the country, the moment seared itself into the memory of all who heard.
Part of me died that day in Dallas. You know, I could never forget it.
Well, it was very hard to accept. He was not only my boss and leader for 11 years, but he was my friend. The idea of his suddenly being removed from the scene when he was at the peak of his powers was simply senseless, irrational, and unacceptable.
Like most Americans, white and black, I was stunned, shocked beyond belief. For weeks, I walked around zombie-like.
And Lyndon Johnson called me on the phone with a very nice call, express his thoughts, and I said, "Thank you, Mr. President," and hung up the phone, and then, for the first time all day, I broke down, realizing that John F. Kennedy was no longer President of the United States.
I thought that everything that I believed in had died with him.
Oh, I think we went through a period there where it was weeks. I mean, of real sorrow. I mean, crying. I mean, an ache. And to me, I had this terrible embarrassment about my country, our country.
The mixture of grief, incredulity, and shame, which one felt that such a thing could have taken place in one's country, something that really hasn't left me yet.
And I think that there wasn't anyone who wasn't personally affected by that. It was so traumatic. The world stood still for a moment.
In Dallas, police searched the school book depository, but Lee Harvey Oswald had already fled. After picking up a pistol from his rooming house, he shot and killed Dallas policeman J.D. Tippett, who tried to question him. Shortly afterward, Oswald was arrested in a movie house. He was put on display at Dallas Police Headquarters.
I positively know nothing about this situation here. I would like to have legal representation.
At 3:38 that afternoon, on board Air Force One, Lyndon Baines Johnson was sworn in as the 36th President of the United States.
Constitution of the United States.
At 6:04 p.m. Eastern Time, the same aircraft, carrying the body of John F. Kennedy, arrived at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington, D.C. Around the world, the display of grief was overwhelming.
For the dreams of a multitude of men rode with him to his death.
This song was part of a special edition of the BBC television program, That Was the Week That Was. Within hours, cast members scrapped their scheduled format of satire and put together this tribute. David Frost was one of the hosts.
But with the murder of John Kennedy, death has become immediate to people all over the world. For the first time, because of the stature of the man and the nature of a shrinking world, people everywhere feel they've lost someone they'll miss.
In Berlin, thousands carried candles into the night. In Latin America and Africa and Asia, there were tears and prayers.
John F. Kennedy's death, for some reason, meant something to everybody.
On Monday, John F. Kennedy was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. It was the most elaborate state funeral in American history. Since that November, there have been hundreds of books, films, and other accounts of John F. Kennedy's administration. Some veterans of those days believe that the new frontier may have been over-romanticized. McGeorge Bundy.
The White House was not sort of one long alternation between touch football and glamorous parties. It was damn hard work, but it was very exciting work with a wonderful guy on top.
Dean Rusk.
He was an incandescent man who tended to set people around him on fire. But his years as president were years of crisis. Fortunately for all of us, he was very cool at moments of crisis. He had ice water in his veins and brought us through some dreadfully dangerous crises safely.
Mac Kilduff.
I suppose the greatest accomplishment of John Kennedy is one that you can't put your finger on because it's not a specific, and that is that he made politics something other than a dirty word.
Letitia Baldridge.
But whatever it was, the young people wrote to the White House from all over the world saying, "We're going into politics, Mr. President."
When John F. Kennedy was alive, it was young people who were most receptive to his ideas. And today, among youngsters who were born long after his death, there is a remarkable awareness of what he stood for.
John F. Kennedy, to me, was a leader who always looked into the future.
He's a people's man. I think he was a caring man.
He wasn't a god or anything like that, but he tried. He tried to do good things.
I think of him starting the Peace Corps and inspiring others into service.
These young people are members of the John F. Kennedy Library Corps in Boston. Sponsored by the Kennedy Library Foundation, they volunteer for community projects throughout the Boston area. Some of them see their work as a 1980s response to a speech made in 1961.
Try to do something for your country instead of looking for your country to do something for you.
Well, his most important message, I think, was one man can make a difference and everyone should try. It's a really good feeling to know that just by working a bit with an idea you have, you can really make a significant difference.
It is this legacy that warms the memories of the friends of John F. Kennedy. 25 years later, how often do you think of him?
Every day.
This NBC News special is sponsored in part by Ford and your Ford dealer, together winning the world over with cars like the Ford Tempo. Have you driven a Ford lately?
This sedan offers a refreshing blend of form and function. And if you like its form...
25 years after that murderous day in Dallas, we still don't know for sure whether Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. There are provocative theories and new witnesses have come forward, but there is nothing to absolutely contradict the findings of the Warren Commission that Oswald was the lone assassin. What we do know is that when the young president was killed, it opened a long run of violence and national agony, lasting almost 2 decades. Historians now are beginning to judge the political record of John F. Kennedy, and that record is getting mixed reviews. But John F. Kennedy, the man, his grace, wit, and intellect, his dedication to public service, John F. Kennedy as a symbol of national achievement, hope, and promise. That legacy is secure. That could not be killed on that day in November. I'm Tom Brokaw. Good evening.
Best of Carson cheers Ted Danson and comedian Stephen Wright. Then on late night, the band makes room for Phil Collins, plus the comedy angst of Richard Lewis. And later, Dan Rather returns.
Some of those millions who are watching are saying, what's with this guy?
Good question, Bob. Stay up for everything tonight on NBC.
He would not return to Washington alive. But that morning, few Americans would guess that calamity was about to strike the country. For most, it was a time of optimism. America seemed to be on the right track. The twist was still big. At the White House, Mrs. Kennedy had given the president private lessons. The Chicago Bears were leading the Western Conference of the National Football League. The civil rights movement was underway, but it had a long way to go. In Hollywood that day, plans were underway for the film production of the musical Camelot.
Don't let it be forgot that once there was a spot for one brief shining moment that was known.
Kennedy's Camelot was brief indeed. The administration of John F. Kennedy lasted only 1,037 days.
Detergents, but gets gleaming white with Tide with bleach. It'll knock your socks off and get them whiter. New Tide with bleach.
When legal disputes threaten, the People's Court Peacekeeping Mobile zooms into action. You two seem to be at loggerheads.
He parked on my petunias.
Don't take the law in your own hands. Take a break and watch the People's Court.
Who was that man in the blue blazer?
The People's Court, weekdays at 3 on Channel 2.
Part 2 of the killing of JFK. Was it a conspiracy? On the next Geraldo.
The following is an NBC special presentation.
It was a fine autumn morning in the nation's capital. At the tomb of the unknown soldier, the sentry maintained a silent vigil over our honored dead. Before nightfall that November day in 1963, a new name would be added to the nation's roll of fallen heroes. A day earlier, President John F. Kennedy had left the White House for a political trip to Texas.
You've got this all wrong. You want to make news of the cereal today, you need a gimmick. Putting a whole banana inside a little bran biscuit, stuff like that. These are just flakes. I don't think I've tasted anything like it. Simple, light, it's really very good. Well, how about that? A cereal that doesn't need a gimmick.
Kellogg's Corn Flakes.
Corn Flakes?
Taste them again for the first time.
I was hired midway into the revolution. The independent forces, PC users, had begun to form guerrilla work groups hooked together like tinker toys. Stubbornly independent, but cut off from the main source of power. No electronic mail from one outpost to the other. No shared resources. Chaos was the price they were paying for freedom. So we put up Wang's PC land. It networks the PCs, yes, but it also networks the networks.
Police call it the priest killings. 2 different murders committed in the same way. It could be the work of a serial killer.
Killing Catholic priests.
Catch a criminal on Unsolved Mysteries Wednesday.
A misty rain was falling in Fort Worth as President Kennedy emerged from his hotel that morning. Even his admirers were surprised by the size of the crowd. President Kennedy was in top form.
Mr. Kennedy is organizing yourself. Take longer. You look better than you did.
Immediately afterward, the president spoke at a fundraising breakfast. Accompanying him throughout his Texas visit were Vice President Lyndon Johnson and Texas Governor John Connally. When Mrs. Kennedy entered the auditorium, the applause was spectacular. When John Kennedy left Washington for Texas, he was on a political mission. He wanted to heal the Texas Democratic Party, badly split between conservatives and liberals. Remember, on that day in November, the 1964 presidential election was less than a year away, and it was very much on Kennedy's mind. After all, John F. Kennedy was a consummate politician.
He was the greatest politician.
Now, 25 years later, we're still struggling to deal with the loss, the myths, and the memories of John Fitzgerald Kennedy and his time.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Many Americans can still recall vividly being moved by the words of John Kennedy. And news of his death moved them in other ways. It marked a turning point in their lives and in the direction of this country. Tonight, in this report, we'll recall 1963, JFK and that day in November.
NBC News presents JFK, that day in November.
This NBC News special, JFK, That Day in November, is sponsored in part by Kellogg's Corn Flakes. Simple, delicious, and surprising. Taste them again for the first time. And by Wang Laboratories. Wang makes it work.